Sorry about that. Yeah, I think all of that, it really is sort of the crux of the question, right? Like, well, what then do you do with it? And the last couple of weeks, what I've really been doing, and you're aware of this, I think if you've been here listening, is sort of unraveling a bit some of the expectation or myths around the Bible that a lot of Christians, especially, have created in order for the Bible to carry a level of authority in communities. And I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I don't think it was always for nefarious reasons. I don't think it was just so that somebody could be taken advantage of or anything like that. I think that there's an awful lot of tendency that we have to take something that's important and to give it a category of being special. And we're learning a lot in different societies and cultures about how different societies and cultures make something special. And many of us are influenced by a period of time where what made it special was that it was different, that it was distinct from the other companion pieces that would exist. So that's something that comes up a lot in Christianity, especially in Protestant Christianity, is how is Christianity, the Bible, Jesus, anything that we hold to be important, how is it distinct from the other things? And so the more different you can make it, the more special it is, and therefore the more power it has. This is sort of an underlying set of assumptions to it. So there's a lot that goes into why we've thought about the Bible the way that we have. What I want to do tonight is to lead the conversation in the direction of what are approaches that one can take to it. So if we've spent a few weeks suggesting that there's some different, the content of it itself might not be what we've been told that it was. That's one thing, and that's sort of what I've tried to do and did. And so whether that was with the Bible as a whole or with the Gospels or especially with that stuff on what Paul was up to and what he was doing, that it might not be what we have thought that it was, nor its intention. That's all of that conversation in some ways has been about the Bible itself, right? When you think about it that way. This conversation tonight, I want to take in the direction of what attitude and approach should we have to the Bible as we approach it. So this engaging the Bible in healthy ways as adults is sort of a two-way street, right? It's both the thing itself as well as us as the one who's engaging. So I've got a little bit to suggest on this. Daniel also called last night and said he's been thinking for a long time about a particular way of thinking about the Bible and has some material here. So he's going to do a little bit on that. And then we're going to have a time for discussion. Okay, so that's what we're going to do. So let's start with, I jotted down a number of ways that I think that people approach the Bible, that in finding healthy ways to do this, right? I think all of these approaches could be a healthy way. Let me just preface a little bit off of Hannah's question of, boy, the way we're talking about this seems like someone would have to have an awful lot of back knowledge to get it. Part of my opinion about the Bible was rooted in my own experience, which I think is true for a lot of us, but it was rooted in the experience that I had that I didn't know about how I was supposed to understand the Bible before I started reading it. What I knew was I had a personal kind of faith experience with an idea of Jesus and God, and saw that in a demonstrated way in a play, and didn't know any of the story. And people around my life that night said, you should get a Bible and start reading it. So that's something that I also thought for some reason knew that the Jesus story was in the Bible. I knew enough of that as a 16-year-old. And so I started reading the Bible. And only later did people start to tell me how it is that I'm supposed to approach the Bible. It feels a bit like somebody that, has their first crush on someone, and they have all these feelings developing, and they start hanging around the person, and then someone comes in and starts to give them relationship advice and tells them how they ought to do it. And that advice sometimes is really different than their own experience. And the Bible got more confusing as I started hearing about these different ways to engage with the Bible and the different sets of rules and regulations around certain aspects of the Bible and concepts that you need to be extracting from it. It just got increasingly complicated. And what I'm not sure of is if that was because that's what happens as you get deeper into it anyway. It just gets more complex. And that sort of summer crush that you might have on someone isn't supposed to last. The relationship you have with a person in that dating metaphor is supposed to get more complex over time, right? It's supposed to be that way. Or if there really was something, and really is something about the over-explanation. I remember this was in the early 1980s, and I remember getting my hands on what at the time seemed terribly exciting, a Ryrie study Bible? Am I saying it right?
Yeah.
Does that sound a Ryrie study Bible. And if you've never seen one of these things, I mean, it's a particular version of a study Bible from a particular person's perspective. But it was all kinds of cross-references. And the kind of Bible that I experienced in my early days in Christianity was the New American Standard version of the Bible. That was the people I was around, that's the one that I found, that I got. All this. It had a line down the middle of every page that was the references, and then the chapter verse, the verses went down the side with this middle bar down the middle. And that middle bar were references to where those passages corresponded to other places in the Bible. And you open up one of these babies, and it is multiple colors, black ink and red ink, which was a little confusing. Then I realized somebody told me it was just the Jesus words are in red. And then there's a column down the middle, and then there are another section at the bottom that has explanations and cross references. All of a sudden, this book is so complicated, and it brought me back to the feeling I had like in 5th or 6th grade trying to learn the Dewey Decimal System in the library. Like, my goodness, this is, and there was a real sense, that was the earliest moment that I had where I felt like, oh, you're supposed to know a whole lot more than I know if you're going to deal with the Bible. My first experiences with it were like, I don't know, like, I'm getting this. I can read English, you know, and I'm picking up these stories. And then this baby lands, and then that was swapped out for a New International Version Study Bible, which was a little better, but equally as complex. Some pages of which had more text explaining at the bottom than text of the Bible at the top, in smaller type. It took more to explain what those verses were, and it all became so much more complicated. Now, I've very much appreciated that. I've really loved, over time as I've grown up and matured, I've realized, oh, these are the variant voices that you start to hear in Bible conversations. There's something sort of rich about it. But that's not how I was introduced to it. I was introduced to it as basically, be sure you're double checking the things you think by the explanations that are down below. So anything you read, make sure you check. Make sure you read the whole bottom before you turn that page, so you don't end up with your own idea. Right? And it wasn't long after that I was hanging around some people who really thought all that stuff was a disaster, shouldn't be there, and you should have the Way copy of the Bible, which was in more modernist language at the time, like the 70s. It was much simpler, and then other Bible versions came out that didn't even have chapter headings in them or section headings in them, and sort of boiling it down, making it more simple. But the damage had sort of already taken place, right? It was already this impression that there's something going on, and then on top of that, the Bible's a little complicated. The Bible's a little complicated just in its own multiple use of people and stories and ideas. So it was formidable in its own right, is what I'm getting at, and then was just made all that much more complicated. So one of the ways, all that to say, one of the ways that people deal with the Bible is in sort of an encyclopedic way of everything you read in the Bible is meant to give you deeper understanding of other things in the Bible. You know what I'm getting at? Like, it is meant to be explaining the other things going on. That's why all those connections at the bottom were so incredibly, were so incredibly important, right? Is because they, um, that was the key to it, right? You were supposed to find your way around the rest of the Bible uh, by verses in the Bible. So where else is this written? Where else is? And it kind of made the Bible a story unto itself. So one way that people approach the Bible is the Bible as a means to explain the Bible. And it's shocking how far that can take you. I don't know. There's something about that can be sort of interesting and intriguing. It makes a world unto itself. It's I heard about a book yesterday on a radio show referencing a person who's like the head of the dictionary, Webster's Dictionary or something, and she wrote a book about words.
The F-bomb.
Yeah, so she had she put the vulgarity in there, and sort of a book about deciding on which words become words you can use in books. Like that's enough to keep you busy the rest of your life, right? So there's a real there's a real sense that that's the way you can approach the Bible. There's another way that people do it, and that is as a script. And the script is this interesting way of reading it. I sort of wish Curdy was here, and she might be coming tonight because she is very much into a particular theologian named Tom Wright, N.T. Wright, who's very interested in thinking about the Bible as sort of a play with a first act and a second act and then a third act. And his way of talking about this and describing this is that your job as modern day followers of this way is not to repeat the first act or the second act, but is to be inspired by that first and second act and to play it out in the third act. And that's a version of what I mean by a script. And another way is that if you're given sort of a script in the way that you are supposed to follow it with your own sensibilities very much alivened, right? So, but you're not to leave the script per se, or if you do leave the script, you need to make a really clear point that you're now off script, right? So if it's freeing because you're called to interpret and to say and to do it in your own way and to sort of imagine a film director using a script for a film, but then the director wants the actor to bring it to life and to put their own storyline in it, but to kind of stay on the script, right? Like don't take the storyline in another direction, but bring to life that storyline. Now that can be a really helpful way to deal with the Bible, to think about it, is that it becomes this operating script. And I don't know if about computer language, but maybe even in computer language, how a script is written. We could ask Kurt about that. But that a script gets written to come into play in a certain set of conditions, and then that script can take over. And then what happens there is then people start to make a really clear distinction between things that are in the Bible arc and things that aren't. And you can get this really clear sense. So this is a way that gets picked up by people who like to advocate for a two kingdoms sort of world to spirituality. The kingdom of spirituality in the church, the Bible's heavy scripted there. But then there's the way you live in the rest of the world, government and your businesses and so on. You should be influenced as a person in your business or in government or the rest of the work you do in the world. But the Bible's really not written for governments or for running your business. There is no how to be a CEO versions of the Bible from Jesus or something, right? Like that's not the point. But when it comes to church matters, this is super important, right? So you can see that going a couple ways. The whole issue on women that becomes a big deal is, well, sure, we could have a woman be a doctor, or we could have a woman be a head of a company, because that's in the world. But in the church, we operate by another script, which is the Bible. And we have to have some flexibility in how we act out that script. But we know when the script ends and when the script doesn't end. That's this intriguing way to go about it. And a lot of people find healthy ways to engage the Bible by doing precisely that. So there's a sense in which you could say, well, I'm going to sort of be inspired by the Bible in these areas of my life. It's really helpful, it's useful, it's powerful. I give it some credibility and authority. Now, by the way, I don't hold to that way of limiting women at all. But you might say, I know some people who might say this about other sort of cultural issues. Like, look, the Bible's not saying a lot about the stock market. That's just, there's no way you can get to the stock market from the Bible. So don't try bringing it up there. You can talk about tithing, but not really off in this other area. So kind of leave the issues where they are and don't overplay your hand on this. So that's the way that some people engage this in the script. Third way, and I'll lose track of the numbers, but a third way is as some kind of inspiration. So you go into the Bible because there are inspiring narratives and stories in there. Not the script you're going to follow, but they kind of bring something to life in you. It seems like, no, this is inspiring. This is a lot of ways some of us were taught about reading the Bible with little kids. Encourage them about these stories that you find in there, this encouragement of these stories. And then as you get a little older, you start to say, oh, look, there's a little larger story. And the story is now of a people on a journey of life and faith, and let that inspire you in how you're going to live. So inspiration is what the thing is about. It's not about finding your way through the Bible. It's not about staying on script. It's about finding some kind of positive inspiration. I think very lowly of that view, personally. We can talk about why in a little bit. I just think, oh my gosh, that is not very, I mean, I guess it works if someone's sophisticated enough to see that it's an awful lot of how not to do it storylines. It just doesn't, it's not really crafted in a way I think that works for kind of modern day fables and inspiration narratives in modern day life. Then there's this kind of metaphorical way of reading it. And a lot of progressive preachers will utilize this. They'll hear the story, they'll find a metaphor that matches it. Zacchaeus went up in a tree. What's the tree in your life that you need to go up? Right? So it kind of launches you into a metaphorical narrative to find yourself in. So some people are really good at this, and they're really good at reading those stories and then making a current day metaphorical reference to that. This gets a little bit into your thoughts on pattern recognitions, because it starts to find that line, which we'll talk about in a bit. But that's a very powerful way, especially for people who are preacher types. If you have to talk, in other words, if you have to talk about the Bible to other people, teachers, preachers, that kind of thing, they really love the metaphorical manner. This is actually one of the things that I think has really hurt progressive Christianity in the 20th century. Is a lot of liberal thinking progressive Christians have gone to the metaphorical way of reading the Bible. And when you're listening to it happen, when someone uses the Bible that way, it can be seriously inspiring. Like, wow, that's amazing what you did there. Like, I think I see it, but it was incredible, the arc that you went and the thing you went on, and that's how it lands on you. And you're like, that's awesome. I could never do that. I would have read that story, and nowhere would I have ever gotten to that place of understanding it. So it creates this distance that there's some people who have the magic to make sense of it, and there's some people who don't. And that's a thing that shows up in a lot of these ways of reading the Bible, is that it really creates a sense that your average ordinary person's not going to pull that off. Like you, that is a skill set. That when someone's good at that, that's when someone starts to say, you should be like a pastor or something. Like if you can pull that off, like that is the magic that you're able to do. A lot of authors are super good at this. You'll find people that write Christian inspirational books. I was a big fan and have been was for a really long time of a guy named Max Lucado in my early days of Christianity. Damn, that guy was good at that stuff. Like he could start with something, a little story, and then spin that thing and weave it into a tale, and all of a sudden you're at, like, wow, that God came near. Like that's awesome. Like it, and he could do it in like 7 pages in a book, and it's really a powerful way of taking that story, working it in a way, and landing it right on your life. Um, then you go into the Bible and you read it and you're like, oh, it's not really, and it starts to feel a bit like that feeling you have about the movie that you watched 15 years ago and really, really thought was funny. And then you watched it again, you realized your memory of it was much more rich than the actual movie itself because all you remembered were the funny parts. So it feels like it was a really funny movie, but it actually was kind of slow. That's what happens when you find yourself going back into those Bible stories and you realize, oh, wow, without all that around it, it kind of lays there. So it elevates preaching and teaching to a level that the Bible's not at itself, and then it creates this odd thing. So I think that it's created a very unhealthy way for people to deal with the Bible. We've outsourced it in a curious way. A couple more. There's the demand version that you read the Bible to see what is required of you. That's a whole way of reading the Bible. Now, all of these ways of reading the Bible, I'll say more about that in a minute, but all these ways of reading the Bible, you could look at them the Bible, the content itself could be whatever it is. It could be this comes straight from the voice of God. It could be this is infallible. It could be this all holds together and comes from the same author. The Gospels are saying one very specific thing, and it's salvation through Jesus. And however you want to see the content itself, you can approach the Bible in any of these particular ways of reading it. And for some of us, our issues are as much the approach we take to engaging the Bible as it is what it is itself. So, so these are not necessarily content dependent. So there's this demand version, and that is you read the Bible for what it demands of you. That you're going to look at it and you're going to find out what you should do and what you shouldn't do. Like, look there, and it is your spiritual, moral, and ethical guidance. You hear this from people who will say like, I think we can have wine because Jesus may turn water into wine at the wedding. It's biblical. If someone uses the phrase "it's biblical," it tends to be someone who's operating the Bible it makes demands on you. Does this meet the demands or not? Right? It's a pretty common way. There's the instructional way of looking at the Bible. That from it doesn't make demands, but it's a really sophisticated instruction book for life. It has the answers to the questions of how you should live your life. Got Bible? Just the Gideons that you mentioned earlier, Tim, sort of come from that approach. There's a set of enduring spiritual questions in humanity, and the Bible has the instructions necessary for whatever's needed. Salvation, life, peace, hope, all that kind of thing. Then there's this last one that I'll mention, and I'm interested to hear what if you all have other versions of this, and that is it is a community member. That's my approach to it. That's the one that I think is the most vital for me. I think it's the most useful, is to recognize that the Bible is a story of faith of people who have been living in particular ways with particular issues that are in front of them. They're trying to find their way to living out the imagination that they see in the life of Jesus, specifically for Christians, over time, and they're trying to live that in their lives, and that becomes a really important conversation partner or companion for us in the life that we're trying to live. And so we ought to engage it as a community member that we should turn to on issues of which it has something to offer, but not on other ones. And what we're experiencing and saying and doing can carry just as much weight as these ancient texts, because the Bible, as I mentioned in other weeks, was not designed to be the beginning and the end of the content that we're supposed to have. So we're not bound by it. It's not a script. It's not a text. It's not. It is not to be understood as some sort of a limit in any way, shape, or form. It is a contribution that sits amidst the other contributions, and that's how we ought to approach it. And so we ought to get to know it really well, like you would getting to know any contribution, a person or a set of ideas that you want to know and understand them well, so that you can engage with them. So that's the particular approach that I take. All right, before you do your bit, is this good? Can we talk about this for a bit? Thoughts, comments, questions? That's 24 minutes of blasting it at you. So, and I intentionally did it in such a way that we wouldn't do any questions yet, right? So let's just sort of get through all of them, and then let's chat about it.
Can I ask you?
Yeah.
So I'm hearing you say it is a contribution, right? At the same time, I'm also hearing you say there's no other text or belief that's brought about how Jesus brought it, that, hey, my way is different, forgiveness and reconciliation and not, judgment and punishment, right? So would it be fair to say you're saying it's more than just a contribution, it's a contribution that is maybe the key to a better way of life? Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, I would. Yeah, that's a
Community
great
member can be demanding.
Yeah, we should talk about that. Okay, but yeah.
But I mean, I think that's your response to what he said, right? Like, it sounds like you're qualifying what he's saying as the Bible as a community member, but it has a special contribution.
Almost a vital contribution,
Yeah.
maybe.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
I might just summarize your sermon this morning and
Yeah, from other
put
stuff.
it together.
Yeah, I think I do hold that view that the Bible has something unique that it contributes, and if you're going to be a community that wants to live in a particular Jesus way, the contribution that the Bible makes is unparalleled by the other good contributions that are made.
Sure.
So there's a sense in which I feel that it has sort of a vital role to it. I will say that I think it can be carried in an oral tradition as well as a written tradition. So I think it can be embedded in the stories that we tell and not only in the pages and the text that we would engage with. So I think we could retell the stories in a way that would be equally as sufficient to the book itself. So as a little caveat there. But I do think, and I think that's why gospel writers wrote, and I think that's why Paul wrote, was because they were saying there is a particular storyline that we're, or a particular narrative that we're telling, and it has some pieces to it that are extremely powerful for what it would mean to live in this way, and to access that story and that arc and to know all of this is essential to experiencing the Jesus kind of life that someone might want to have. So I know a lot of people and think highly of the way they approach the world, who would say, I'm not all that interested in matching my life to the ancient Jesus narrative. I'm interested in matching my life to the spiritual life that Jesus was pointing toward, that we would see it in Jesus as the Christ. So it's really common with a lot of people that I run around with and some of my dearest friends to be much more into the Christ part of Jesus Christ than they are into the Jesus part of Jesus Christ. And they'll make a really clear distinction about that. They'll even say things like, you can't, the thing you're trying to access, like their pushback to someone like me would be, like the thing you're trying to access that you say that the Jesus story unfolds, that's not really findable and possible. You don't really get that out of the Bible, because what the Bible is doing is painting a picture of a kind of Christness, the cosmic Christ, as some of them might like to say it, that there's this expression of the Spirit of Christ in the world, and that's what we want to be living in, and we're no longer bound by, and it's a good thing we're not bound by, a 2,000-year-old Palestinian story. Right? So that's and I'm trying to make my life orient around a particular Jesus narrative that I think carries an awful lot of power for how we want to organize ourselves in its social dynamics as well as its personal and interpersonal dynamics. So for me, that the human part of that story, not just the arc of the spirituality of the Christ narrative, is more compelling. So I know I got off a little bit on that question, but that's a I think a keenly sussed out nuance of the stuff that I'm sort of chasing out. That the Bible carries an awful lot of influence on that particular topic, and I think that particular topic has a lot of power and is really important. Right, so it's that little juxtaposition that I think really matters, and this shift from this little subtle distinction between the Jesus of the Gospels and the influence of life thing, and the Christ narrative and that which is being propelled going forward. And a lot of my friends would argue the Paul that you're such a big fan of, he's actually much more into the Christ than he is into the Jesus. Because he doesn't go back to the Sermon on the Mount. He doesn't go back to the narratives of the crucifixion. He uses that as Jesus has now been exalted to be the Christ, and as the Christ, this is the implication that Jesus has been exalted, is taken the right hand, set at the right hand of the throne of God, and is expressing the cosmic Christ that has existed for all time. Right? That's a very Paul kind of argument. So they would say, it's kind of odd, isn't it, that you want to be this sort of lived life, but the one person that first did that, this Paul, was actually doing that through this Christ narrative. So that's a good point. It's actually a good point that they're making. But I'm much more interested in the narrative as it is a calling of a community to live in the way of, not only the storyline of empowered by the Christ that indwells us. So it will follow up, I think.
Thanks for clarifying that. And so may I ask a follow-up question?
Yeah.
And if you don't think it's relevant to this session, that's you don't have to address it. So what's the consequence to you for one that does not, believe that the ideal way is Jesus's way, without the judgment and you know what I mean? Because traditionally there's if you don't believe in Jesus, then you go to hell, or you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so I don't, so this is the ideal way to follow Jesus is forgiveness and right? But is there, and maybe there is no answer, but what in your estimate?
I don't know, no answer. That's a great question. I don't know if I think there's no answer. I just think it's not all that, it's not dire in the way of you don't of what you get instead. It's dire in the sense of you really miss out on the implications, on the helpful implications of the life of Jesus. So part of the thing that I believe about the spirituality of Jesus is that what Jesus is demonstrating and actualizing, the gospel writers are telling, and the other New Testament writers are advocating, is that which Jesus does and is doing is what humanity is created to do. So Jesus is calling people to live into their full humanity. He's not calling for them to be somehow outside of or empowered in some way that requires the additive of Jesus. That only when that's put in, then do you get this other reward. But what Jesus is calling for is that people would live into the fullness of God that they are endowed with, created in, and all of that. So that's the calling. It's this calling people to the fullness of Christ, as Paul might say, instead of, the consequence is if you don't get the upgrade, like if you don't upgrade your phone, like it's not going to work. You're not going to ultimately get there. You just have to have the upgrade. So that's the consequence of it. And so that's where the Bible, to Alex's message or comment earlier, I just looked over because she goes off for a second. Alex's comment earlier about the sort of the consequences of the whole thing. That's the comment. All right, there's still a lot. Anybody else thoughts on any of those multiple ways? I can remind you of what any of them are. If you want.
sort of wondered, maybe there is one that is this covers, but if there's one that views the Bible as like an like an idol, like that you believe in the Bible more than you believe in Jesus or like Christ, or
Great point.
that you're like married to the Bible and not married to.
Yeah, that's so fun. I can feel myself like, of course, I say that all the time. That there's that Protestants tend to hold to the Trinity of Father, Son, and Holy Scriptures, and that all three are required for salvation, and that it becomes a part of God. It's almost
Totally.
worship, and I didn't include that because I was trying to do in my own head of the list. What are the things? What are ways that people can engage the Bible in healthy ways? Because I was trying to say,
Oh, sure.
all of these, there's a way you could have a healthy way that you utilize that. I don't think they're the best ways, but that one, which is really, really common, that it almost becomes a God unto itself. So you would see that in people that are like, did you seriously put a Bible on the floor? Don't put a Bible on the floor. I heard that when I was early in Christianity, like people were like, hey, make sure you keep your Bible in a nice place. Or they didn't even want people writing in them. Like highlighter, okay, but nothing else. And if you ever heard any of that stuff, the pages were thinner. Like it was very highly esteemed in and of itself. And if you misused it or got it wrong, I mean, you were really violating something holy. Well, that's what you're getting at, isn't it? It's holy.
Mm-hmm.
It even gets that name, the Holy Bible.
Mm.
Yeah.
So there's
Super common.
the notion of healthy ways of approaching the Bible. What is healthy? I think it's very intriguing, because of course there are unhealthy groups to be a part of, unhealthy ways of holding knowledge and communicating knowledge, and so I imagine I want to make a connection that there's unhealthy ways to relate to scriptures, and must be related to the unhealthy dynamics of different communities, I suppose, control groups perhaps, or cults, or abusive groups, something like that. Or along the spectrum, but more patriarchal ways of communities organizing each other, and therefore more patriarchal ways of relating to scripture or using scripture. So so it's an interesting theme to think about.
Good. Before Daniel launches into this additional way, this pattern recognizing kind of way, which I think is really common. Anybody else with thoughts or comments? Or
I didn't hear you make a distinction because I came in late. Sorry, I was over Chris Mike's up. We got in a big theological discussion before I even got here. Were you making a distinction between just calling it the Bible, like the Old Testament, and the New Testament? Because I definitely separate. I mean, I separate the Old Testament into just basically, like I was told, the stories of the dysfunctional families of Judah.
Yeah.
I mean, that's, boom. And then, the Christian Gospels and the rest of the related material there was something else. It was to take the old processes and kind of poke holes in them and say, hey, there's another way. We can live in this community and we can treat each other nicely. Whereas there's not a lot of, there's a lot of really crazy stuff going on in the Old Testament. Killing, maiming and blah, blah, rape, pillage, and plunder. And people, I like to make a distinction because I think that there's, the canon was divided.
Yeah.
And then and when I took a class in high school and realized this was all edited, I was like, where's the stuff that was left out?
Yeah, that stuff on the cutting.
So, I mean, I've done the Gnostics and the Didactic and all this other stuff, but when you realize the similarities between there, I look at the Bible as a collection that was chosen for economic, political, and the times then put together. And it's good to understand that, but then understand that there's some really similar stories in other traditions, cultures, and even, the world's history that were left out of the picture.
Mm-hmm.
And that way I don't look at it as the only way to get that Christ community spirit.
Yeah.
I mean, a secular humanist could get there in that spirit. They
Yeah.
might say, "Oh, I don't believe in Christ," but they behave. Their
Yeah.
behavior is there.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? So it becomes a guidebook for those who choose to use it in a helpful way.
Yeah, that's
for
helpful,
guidebook.
Charmaine, thanks, yeah. To that earlier question, a little bit of a distinction between the Old and New Testament in the sense that for Christians, they take the canon as it was given to them by the Jewish
Right.
faith, and Christians had to recanonize their 27 books of the Bible into a particular set. So yeah, there's a difference and a distinction. I don't know that many of the different ways people engage the Bible, they necessarily make too big of a distinction between the Old and the New Testament. Surprising. I mean, some traditions do theologically, but not so much others.
I just think it's helpful to know that when you make that distinction, you look at like, here's the history, it's the dysfunctional families, and all this craziness going on. But then there's this other way. And so when you put the two together, you've got the history and you've got all this richness in the stories, and some of it reflects forward and some reflects backward. But as Christians, then this is what we use to go forward with the Holy Spirit, or that third level,
Yeah.
into the community.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah,
And if
I
you
did
accept
talk
it
about
that
this.
way,
I did talk
that's-
about this the first week. I think that Jewish scriptures have their own debate going on.
Sure.
So and I think it's a priestly versus prophetic debate in the religious community, and that carries over into the New Testament period, and that carries on and is happening. So I don't do a thing with the Old Testament that it's sort of all one thing. It is a dynamic discussion amongst that faith about which way are we going to go, which kind of narrative of God are we going to follow, the God of violence or the God of Yahweh. And that's a big debate. And that carries over literally right into the New Testament. Jesus is into it. A lot of the writings in the New Testament are doing it. And so I do something a little different in thinking about the similarity of those patterns. But yes, there are parts of the Old Testament that are pretty much what as you described it, in my view, which are
What's kind of funny too is that people,
family stories.
if you make this comment, some people, they're like stunned, but they're like, Jesus was a Jew.
Yeah.
I mean, he was not a Christian. There was nobody called a Christian then. And they're like, what do you mean?
Yeah.
It's like, well, yeah.
Well, and our Jewish, my Jewish friends and Rabbi Joseph
Right.
Eli would say, but not a Jew like today's Jews. Like
Right.
there was a kind of Jew that existed then that doesn't exist now. So yes, Jesus was a Jew, but don't make that correlation to modern day Jews. It was a Jew of a particular time and kind. All right, Daniel, do you want to give us a rundown on this stuff you've got, and then we'll do some interaction?
Okay.